Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected President of the United States in 1952. He asked Apostle Ezra Taft Benson to serve as his Secretary of Agriculture. In our next conversation with Dr. Matt Harris, we'll talk about President Benson's time in the Eisenhower administration. It's a really fun conversation. I hope you check it out. I also want to remind you this is not the first time we've talked with Dr. Harris. We talked with him previously last year when we talked a little bit about his other projects he's working on with blacks and the temple ban. So I encourage you to check that out. We're going to replay our introduction because it has been about a year since we aired that. But we're going to focus primarily on President Benson this time. So check it out. And if you want to get a copy of either this transcript or the one that we're recording right now, please go to subscribe on our website. Go to gospeltangents.com and click on the yellow subscribe button. Also, if you'd like to get a PDF copy of this transcript, you can go to gospeltangents.com/shop and get those. If you subscribe for just $10 a month, I'll send you a transcript of this interview as soon as it's published. And by the way, we've got our new Ben Spackman transcript out now, so please pick that up. Now back to our conversation. Well, welcome to Gospel Tangents podcast. I'm really excited to meet with Dr. Matt Harris here at Colorado State University, Pueblo. This is my farthest interview yet. I've talked to somebody from Australia and somebody from Italy, but this is my farthest away yet. So we're here in Pueblo, Colorado. So, Matt, could you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, Matt Harris is my name. I've been teaching here since 2005. Started my professional career at Dixie State University, Southern Utah. And I went to BYU for a bachelor's and a master's degree in history, and another master's degree and PhD at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York.
Go Orange.
Yeah.
Well, cool. And so, I have to say, I think you, and I'm going to try to flatter you a little bit here, but I really believe this. I think you are one of the gems in the Mormon community that people don't know yet. And I feel like I've discovered you, and I'm like, because I think you're doing some awesome work in Mormon history.
Thanks.
And so, could you talk a little bit about some of the projects you're working on?
Yeah, so in 2015, I published a book with Newell Bringhurst called The Mormon Church in Blacks, A Documentary History. And that was my first foray into Mormon studies. I started my career as an early American scholar, so did a book on the Founding Fathers and Religion in American history, and then also a book with a BYU professor named Jay Buckley on Thomas Jefferson and Zebulon Pike and the exploration of the American West. And then I caught the Mormon history bug, and so did the Black and Mormon book in 2015. And I've been working on several projects since then. I have 2 books on Ezra Taft Benson that will be published next year. And I have a book on a collection of essays that I've edited with Newell Bringhurst on the Gospel Topics essays, which is really fascinating. And then finally, my big project that I'm really excited about is a second book on the LDS Church in Blacks since World War II. And that'll be out. I have 3 chapters written, and that'll be out. Who knows when it'll be out?
Okay.
2019, maybe.
Well, that's interesting because that's actually the topic that I really want to talk to you about today. But 2 books on Ezra Taft Benson. Is this like going to be a Quinn?
No.
It doesn't fit in 1 book, so you got to do 2.
Well, the first book is it's a documentary history of Elder Benson, and it's a lengthy introduction, probably 100-page introduction, which is strange for an introduction.
Wow, that is long.
Contextual essay. And the book is a collection of documents that have never been published on Benson's life. So his FBI files, part of those are published. Letters to the John Birch Society president. He was very good friends with Robert Welch. Bob Welch is his name. Also oral histories that was done with the family. And so a lot of stuff from the Eisenhower collection, library, which is where the Benson family deposited the agricultural papers with Ezra Taft Benson in the early 2000s. So a lot of documents that have never been published before. That's the first book. The second book is, I've edited a collection of essays on Elder Benson, and it's about his rise in politics in the Eisenhower administration, also as a significant conservative leader after World War II. Most people don't realize that he was a presidential candidate and that he was very, very close with Barry Goldwater and some other leading conservative intellectuals, or leaders, I should say, politicians after World War II. And then, of course, Benson is a churchman. And as we can, I'm sure, talk about in a minute, Benson didn't make a whole lot of distinction between his politics and his religion. So it's a collection of essays from folks at BYU in Provo, BYU in Idaho. I did an essay, let's see, who else? Goodness. Matthew Bowman did an essay, who's a very good scholar. Newell Bringhurst, Gary Bergera. So a wide range of people contribute to this volume. I'm excited about it.
Yeah. So let's go back to the 60s a little bit, because one of the things that has always bothered me, and I got this from Greg Prince's book on President McKay, was that, President Benson was a staunch anti-communist, and he accused the communists of trying to use the civil rights movement as a communist conspiracy to foment dissent, or trouble in the United States. Kind of like with President Trump. It's kind of funny, but
we were having a good interview until you mentioned that name.
But it's funny how the Russians come right back into this. But one of the things that really bothered me was him accusing Martin Luther King of being a communist conspirator, as well as President Eisenhower, which just boggles my mind. And so I want to kind of, we're still talking about the ban, and it seems funny to me as we look at this. President Benson was clearly against civil rights, clearly against interracial marriage. And so when we talk about this vote that you've talked about, as well as Michael Quinn in 1969, about overturning the ban, it seems like Benson seemed to be in favor of that, or I don't know if you have documentation on that. So can we, I know that's a big long question there, and there's a lot to unpack, but can we talk about that time period and maybe President Benson's conflicting views on the ban?
Yeah, so we can start in the 60s, and if you want, we can, I think your readers might find it fascinating to get into his church presidency in the 80s and 90s.
Right.
Yeah, because there's some good stuff in the research that I found there too. So before we get to the 60s and civil rights, I think the context is really important. So President, or Elder Benson at the time, Elder Apostle Benson, was always conservative, grew up in Whitney, Idaho, in this very rough and ready farming community. He's very independent, very hardworking, and grew up in a conservative family. And he works in Boise, Idaho, as he goes to school, goes to BYU, and he gets a master's degree in agricultural economics. And anyway, does his undergrad at BYU, and incidentally studies with Lowry Nelson, the guy we were talking about earlier.
Oh, really? Yeah. That's interesting.
And Lowry Nelson, as an older man, becomes a harsh critic of his former student, who's now an apostle. That's another whole story.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how these things play out. So yeah, but Larry Nelson taught Ezra Taft Benson sociology.
Really?
And he said he was a good student. I gave him an A-.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he remembered the grade he gave him.
That'd break a FERPA rule now.
Right. I think Larry Nelson was in his 80s when he said that. I don't think he cared. Anyway, so Elder Benson, he comes up in this agricultural community, and he goes to Boise, Idaho. He works for I can't remember the title. What's it called? The National Association for the Farmers Cooperative or something. And his job is to enforce the agricultural policies of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And now this is the most liberal president to this point probably in American history. He creates the modern welfare state as we know it today. And Social Security would be an important government program that President Roosevelt creates. It still affects us today, obviously. Anyway, so this very liberal president who has done some initiated or presided over an administration that creates some farming policy that Benson is tasked with creating, but he just finds repulsive, like destroying crops in order to stabilize the volatile market economy. Crazy stuff. And Elder Benson doesn't like this. He's not Elder Benson yet, I guess. And So he leaves that position in Boise, and in 1943 he's called into the Quorum of the 12, the same day that Spencer W. Kimball's called in. And Kimball's his senior by not much, a few hours.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so President Kimball and President Benson are called into the Quorum the same day in 1943. And I'll make sure my memory's not wrong on that, but I think that's accurate. Anyway, so Elder Kimball is, one of the first things he's asked to do is to go to war-torn Europe to preside, to help to rebuild the church in Europe after World War II. And this, of course, the saints are suffering, as many Europeans are. They're starving, their lives have been shattered, their homes have been destroyed, and so Elder Benson has this incredibly daunting task to help rebuild their lives there. And it's really heroic in many things that he does. And he brings a companion with him, Frederick Babel, is his traveling companion. And Elder Benson's a very serious and intense man. And Babel, as his traveling companion, is told by his passive voice, don't know who tells him this, but somebody tells him that you're going with Elder Benson, and don't talk to him unless he talks to you first, because he's very serious and very intense. And so let him initiate the conversation. That's kind of an interesting insight into his personality. Anyway, so Elder Benson does some heroic stuff in war-torn Europe, comes back and reports to the brethren what had happened. And in 1952, late 52, Elder Benson's distant cousin, a guy named Robert Taft, who's one of the most influential senators, is floating Ezra Taft Benson's name to be the agricultural secretary in Dwight Eisenhower's cabinet. Also, there's a U.S. senator, Taft is from Ohio, I might add, and he never joined the church. Arthur Watkins, a Utah senator, is also floating Benson's name because of his work with agriculture in Boise. And Dwight Eisenhower has never met Benson before, but yet he wants a churchman into his cabinet because he thinks it will help with religious people, for one, and for two, he also wanted somebody in the Midwest. And even though, I guess technically Utah's not in the Midwest, he thought that would help him with the Midwest vote. And so he calls Benson, and Benson says, you sure you want me? I didn't even vote for you.
Oh, really?
I didn't even vote for you. And he goes to, so anyway, I won't go into all the details, but he gets the blessing from President McKay, gets the green light to take a leave of absence from his apostolic duties to go to Washington. And what's interesting is, when he's going to Washington, this is the era of McCarthyism, where Joseph McCarthy, one of the least effective senators at the time, they have these ranking agencies, and I think he was ranked, one agency ranked him 100. There's only 100 people in the U.S. Senate, so this isn't very flattering. And they put him at 100, and he's up for re-election. And clearly, I don't have this distinguished record, I've got to do something to get people's attention. So let's accuse the State Department of being commies, and let's accuse the U.S. military of leaning red. So this is that communist frenzy from McCarthy.
The military of leaning red, that doesn't even make sense.
So he'll accuse certain high-ranking military officers of being sympathetic to communism. This is Joseph McCarthy. And that ultimately is what brings him down. They'll have these Army McCarthy hearings, and the Army wants to know, you've accused us, how dare you? And where's your evidence? And it's on TV even. Mm-hmm. So, but he goes to this rampage. There's commies everywhere in the State Department, the military, Hollywood. He just goes through all of this stuff. And Elder Benson's coming into government service at this time. And initially he thinks that McCarthy's off his rocker. He's nuts. But Elder Benson had something, a view that he had believed for a long time, that there were commies in the U.S. government, stretching back to the 1930s. In his own government cabinet, agricultural cabinet, the first communist cell was led by a man named Alger Hiss from the 1930s. And so Elder Benson, or Secretary Benson, thinks that there are commies in the Ag Department, the same department that he's asked to preside over. That's an important point.
Hmm.
He thinks that the first communist cell in the United States government occurred under his department.
Now, Alger Hiss, was he convicted of being a communist then?
It was.
That's what I
Spent
thought.
time in prison and denied it to the day he died.
Oh, wow.
And just a quick aside, when the archives opened up after the fall of the old Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s, the archives opened up and scholars went back, and he definitely was on their payroll.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Wow.
he was. I can't remember his handler name. It was agent code something. I can't remember. But anyway, the documents clearly reveal that he was a double agent. He was a spy.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, in that sense, Elder Benson's, there's something to it. And anyway, so that's so he wants to root people out of the State Department or out of the Ag Department, and he's going to look at his shop first. And so there's a State or an Ag Department employee that he'll go after first. And without going into all the details, Secretary Benson will, and his cabinet secretary, guy named Smith from Utah, comes out to be his secretary, or his chief of staff, I think is what it is. But anyway, that Smith and Benson will go after this man from he's from Eastern Europe. And his family is behind the Iron Curtain, even though he's come to the United States. And anyway, they get him fired, and there's no evidence that he's communist, but Benson thinks he's a commie. And Eisenhower will see the evidence, and this guy's not there's no evidence for this. So he'll overturn and reinstate this department, this government employee somewhere else. In fact, what's odd about it is this Eastern European man, I can't remember his name, it'll come to me.
It's in your note coming book anyway, right?
Well, it's in an article I published it's a long day on a Friday. Anyway, so Eisenhower sees the evidence that Benson allegedly had, and it wasn't convinced by it. In fact, this man had written against communism. Somehow Benson missed that or didn't think it was sincere enough. So anyway, Eisenhower overturns Benson and reinstills this guy in some other place in the government, some other outside of agriculture. And Benson never apologizes for this, and this man is really deeply wounded by this because he's now accused by this cabinet secretary that he's a commie. And as far as I know, that's the only instance in which Benson had let McCarthyism affect him. And he didn't go after commies at that point. But anyway, nonetheless, he institutes these very, very draconian agricultural policies. He wants to overturn the New Deal ag policies, in which you destroy surplus crops in order to stabilize the market economy. And one of the things that he wants to do is he thinks that Franklin Roosevelt had what he called socialized agriculture. Benson doesn't believe in socialized agriculture. That's a fancy way of saying subsidies to farmers, the government, federal subsidies to farmers, which really kicks up in the 1930s during the Great Depression when the Roosevelt administration wants to help out these beleaguered farmers. And Benson doesn't think it's the government's role to do this. So anyway, he would go to these public events, Benson, and give speeches, and farmers would show up and throw eggs at him. They would heckle him. I mean, they were angry. You can imagine this. And I have to remind people that Benson's not a rogue here. He's doing what President Eisenhower wants him to do. And so I want to be clear on that he has the support of President Eisenhower in this, because Eisenhower is not as conservative as Secretary Benson, but clearly thinks that some of these federal subsidies need to be curtailed. And when you're dealing with people's livelihood, these impoverished farmers, you can expect some pushback. So anyway, throughout 2 terms in office, Eisenhower stands by Benson. And Benson's popularity in the cabinet puts the entire presidency in jeopardy. And I think I feel comfortable in saying that. A lot of scholars will claim that by the second election in 1956, when Eisenhower's up for re-election, there's a huge push, even among Republicans, to drop Benson because he's so controversial with these farm subsidies, with cutting these farm subsidies. Eisenhower stands by him. And even at one point, President McKay travels to Washington, D.C. and says, President Eisenhower, if you want to relieve Secretary Benson, we'd love to have him back. And that was his way of saying, we don't want any more bad publicity. It's not making the church look good when you have a high-ranking church officer taking this kind of abuse in the news. And so anyway, President Eisenhower, being the loyal man that he is, military background, this is loyalty, and tells President McKay, I want him to stay. And he develops a friendship with Secretary Benson, and they invite him, the Eisenhowers, over to family home evening one night, and the Benson children sing for he and Mamie. And President Eisenhower says that this confirms why I chose your husband, because he's a churchman, he's religious, and I admire this about him. So he stands by him, and they finish out the term in 1961, and I'm sorry, this is a lengthy lead up, but the context of this is really important before we get into the commie stuff. And so Eisenhower and he form a close relationship. Well, when the cabinet is over, when the presidency ends in 1961, Benson goes back to Utah and resumes his duties as an apostle. He's caught the presidential bug. He wants to be a president. And he flirts with running for the presidency in 1960. President McKay puts the kibosh on that pretty quick. But meantime, as he's contemplating his next move in politics, and there'll be many moves after Eisenhower's cabinet.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matt Harris. In our next conversation, we'll talk about how President Benson changed his tune on President Eisenhower.
After the speech, a reporter comes up to him and says, do you agree with Robert Welch that Eisenhower's a commie? That's a direct question, right? Deserves a direct answer. And Benson refuses to rebuff the thought that Ike's a commie. He sidesteps the question. He doesn't address it. And then the byline in the New York Times the next day is, Secretary Benson won't rebut that President Eisenhower's a commie. You can imagine it creates a buzz stir in the church.
We'll have a transcript out shortly on this conversation, and you can purchase individual copies at our website at gospeltangents.com/shop. If you want to be the first to get a copy, please subscribe on our website for just $10 a month. I'll send it to you first as a PDF. Or if you'd like a physical copy for $15 a month, I'll be happy to send that to you as well. You can get our transcripts at our Amazon.com author page. I've got a link here, but just do a search for Gospel Tangents interview and you should be able to find a bunch of them there. Please subscribe at patreon.com/gospeltangents. For $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview uncut. And for $10, you can get a PDF copy. We've also got a $15 tier where if you want a physical copy, I'll be the first to send it to you. So please subscribe at Patreon or on our website at gospeltangents.com as well. For our latest updates, please like our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. And also check our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents as well. Please subscribe on our Apple Podcasts page at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents, or you can subscribe on your Android device. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again.